Okay, then let's start. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Hello and welcome to the second event of the speaker series, Social Policy Unpacked, Exploring Pathways for Green and Digital Transitions. It is co-organized by the Directorate-General for Employment, Social Affairs and Inclusion and the ZOE Institute for Future Fit Economies. My name is Christoph Gran. I'm the co-founder of the ZOE Institute. It's a think and do tank based in Germany, but meanwhile, we have a Brussels office as well, and we work at the interface of science and policy. And yeah, we're specialized in co-creation and new economic thinking. The speaker series aims at giving outstanding thinkers the possibility to channel their ideas and approaches into the European policy debate. We want to invite policymakers, but also the wider public, to think outside the box. We live in times where business as usual is not working anymore. And this certainly includes giving the social questions the importance they need, as they are key for a successful implementation of the Green Deal. And with this speaker series, we will take a variety of thematic perspectives to shed light on the implications for social and employment policy, but also regarding gaps for research and innovation of these questions, or research on these questions. So in the series, we have 12 online seminars running from December 22 until June 23. We've already had the first event on the interplay of green and digital transition, and you can find the recording and the slides on our homepage. The next events will be on meeting the basic needs within planetary boundaries. How can this be paid for? Is it affordable? And we will have Anna Kuti from the New Economics Foundation on the 22nd of February. After that, we'll have Professor Claudius Gräbner and Jakob Havele. He's the managing director of ZOE. And they will shed light on the relevance of regional divides for the green transition. This will be on the 8th of April in 23. But you can find all the dates on the website. We will share or just share it in the chat. The series is funded by the European Commission under the Horizon Europe program, and it's open to the public. Big thanks to Frank Thomas and his team for this absolute great initiative. And yeah, again, today at the end of the session, we will have the possibility to ask questions to the speaker. We will start collecting these questions during the intervention. So please use the Slido link in the chat to pose your questions. And don't forget to vote for the questions you like most and where you're looking forward to an answer. If Slido is not working, you can also write your questions directly into the chat and we will transfer it to Slido. Enough talking for the beginning. It's not me talking here. We should give the stage to Dr. Joan Donovan. I'm thrilled to have you here. Joan is the research director at the Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics and Public Policy, specifically of the Technology and Social Change research project. It's called TASK, and it's part of the Harvard Kennedy School. Her research and teaching interests are focused on media manipulation, effects of disinformation campaigns, and adversarial media movements. So she's exploring how this media manipulation is a means to control public conversation, derail democracy, and disrupt society. Very important topic, I would say, and I'm very curious to hear more about this. And in the next 30-35 minutes, John will elaborate on the question, how social and digital media impact public perception. John, I'm very happy to have you here, and I give the stage to you. Looking forward to your input.
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I'm honored to have the time with you all. And so I'm going to go through this presentation, and then afterwards we'll have time for Q&A, but also feel free to throw questions in the chat, and hopefully I'll be able to see them and incorporate them into the presentation. I'm going to share my screen here and put my slideshow up. And so what we're going to be talking about today is really about the true costs of misinformation. I'm going to assume that you have a fairly decent handle on the major problems, if you've been paying any attention to the role of social media in our elections, public health, in myriad public discussions about potential wedge issues or polarizing issues in society. There is misinformation everywhere. And in a paper with Claire Wardle, I argue that misinformation is everybody's problem now. And we're going to talk a little bit about the production of moral and technical order, which I think is what policy aims to do. Policy aims to give us a framework for thinking about how our ethics and our morals align with the technology that we're building. And then, of course, we can't forget the context in which we're living. We're living through a pandemic, which is one of the most catastrophic things to happen in this generation's lifetime. It's shaping how we give education. It's revolutionizing the technologies that we are working with day in and day out. If you had asked somebody in 2019, what's a Zoom? Nobody would know. Nobody would know. It was primarily a B2B technology. It was business to business. It wasn't really something that we were part of, but it's become its own space and place, and it's required its own set of tools and techniques and guidance, and we've been able to adapt to it rather quickly without too much and too many problems. But that's because this technology is really focused on serving a particular kind of purpose. The issue, as I'll describe it with social media, is that it tries to be everything for everyone. And as a result, it's a hard thing to legislate. It's a hard thing to regulate. It's a hard thing to even name. Some people will say, oh, social media is a broadcast technology. Other people will say it's a form of media in and of itself. And I think that it's really important that we don't let our desire to philosophize the problem to overthink it. What we really need to do is look at its effects and see if we can't tamp down some of the more difficult and destructive impacts of social media. So I'm going to go over a couple of definitions just so that we're all on the same page. When I'm saying media in this presentation, I'm talking about an artifact of communication. This is like Intro to Comms 101. So when I'm talking about the news or news organizations, I'll say that. But media could really be anything. It could be a piece of paper. It could be a JPEG. It could be a documentary. It could be a textbook. It's something that is shareable for the most part. Manipulation, though, is a little bit different. When we talk about manipulation on my team, we're talking about to change by artful or unfair means so as to serve one's purpose. And we leave the word artful in there because not all manipulations are exactly negative. We do have instances where artists and other kinds of social actors use media manipulation to uncover or unveil some kind of issue going on. And so we don't always want to suggest that manipulation is this incredibly nefarious activity. And then lastly, disinformation is the creation and distribution of intentionally false information for political ends. Now, if I were to define misinformation, it would simply be the creation and distribution of false information. A very broad, very generic term. Maybe you could consider it like a master category, whereas disinformation, we have to know the intent, and we usually can figure out that it is not just merely for political, but merely for financial means or fun. Some of the chaos that we see online is just for fun, but that we can discernibly tell that there was a political motive involved. If there were financial means involved as well, that can still be disinformation. But if it's strictly for finance or for making profit, usually we talk about that as a scam or a grift or fraud. And then there's a lot of things that fall in the middle that we would call hoaxes. But for my team and for our work, calling something disinformation requires us to have a whole nother level of insight and appreciation for the actors involved. So what does it mean to produce or co-produce moral and technical order? I draw from Chris Kelty, an anthropologist at UCLA, who documented the development of the free software movement. And this is where a lot of the Silicon Valley entrepreneurs that we now know as the owners of the major platforms, particularly Zuckerberg and Musk, were at some point involved in this kind of movement about that software was going to change the world, and that our relationship to computing was going to change. And so the identity of geek, to be a geek, wasn't a bad thing, because it was about the production of moral and technical order. So he writes, geeks fashion together both technology, principally software, hardware, networks, and protocols, with an imagination of the proper order of collective political and commercial action. That is, of how economy and society should be ordered collectively. So we shouldn't think of a project like Facebook as simply a technology project. And of course, over the years, Zuckerberg has suggested as much. As well, the ethos of Silicon Valley about move fast and break things has turned into a kind of moral theater about connecting people and bringing societies together and harnessing the world's knowledge. And of course, wrapped all in that is the talk about democracy. And in some instances, it's almost as if you can't talk about democracy without talking about social media anymore. Of course, I can remind us that there was a democracy before Facebook, and there will be a democracy after social media. But in the interim, we do have to reckon with these projects, these technology projects, that within them have the grain of this desire to change the economy, particularly, and change our politics, change the way we do news and information. So it's much more than just connecting people to people. It's connecting bits to bits, connecting content to content. And over the years, we've moved from, at least over the last decade, this belief that social media is going to be harnessed for liberation and for marginalized people across the globe to speak truth to power. And instead, we have this inversion of people with immense amounts of power taking over and utilizing technology at these enormous scales to convince and even incite large populations of people to do things that are either against the law or against the wishes of other citizens, particularly in the case of the US in January 6th. That kind of orchestration of a riot at the Capitol probably would have been much more difficult to produce without social media at the helm. So when we talk about that, I have a white paper about weaponizing the digital influence machine, trying to understand the back end of social media. Social media is nothing but advertising. It is advertisement delivery systems that you get to use to share your posts. But by and large, it is designed in order to deliver ads. And that's how they make their money. So the digital influence machine is the infrastructure of data collection and targeting capacities developed by ad platforms, web publishers, and other intermediaries, which includes consumer monitoring, audience targeting, and automated technologies that enhance its reach and ultimately its power to influence. So instead of thinking about social media as this place where I go and I post, we have to think about it as having a back end, which is about collecting your movements, where you leave and drag and drop your mouse. Well, I guess there's not a lot of mouses these days, but on your trackpad, as well as how long you dwell on a particular post before you scroll, what you click from, how long you stay there. The reason why we have browsers built into our apps now is so that it can enhance the monitoring of your movements across the web. And then all of that data about you is compiled into a profile and then batched in these buckets and sold to advertisers. And in this case, some of the advertisers are not advertising goods and services. They're not trying to sell you candy or get you to come to their event. They're selling political ideologies. They're selling ideas about the world. They're trying to influence you into different kinds of political or health behaviors. And in that way, the advertising infrastructure isn't solely just about the exchange of money and information, but it's really about moving hearts and minds. And over the last several years, we've seen the use of online advertising and the use of social media technology be used for many different destructive and dangerous ends. So all of this is free, which feels kind of weird, don't you think? Like, you go in, you engage with Facebook, it's free. You go on Twitter, it's free. You go on YouTube, it's free. For a while, there were no advertising. And in many ways, what we ended up doing was adopting these technologies rather quickly without thinking about, well, what happens when they scale? What happens when they replace some of the basic infrastructure for cities and towns? What happens when libraries are dependent upon their Facebook page to deliver information to their patrons? What happens when the law enforcement officers are using Twitter to deliver orders to the city about, upcoming weather events, or and so we haven't really thought about, well, what is the role of social media as public infrastructure? And then also, well, who all is paying the price for all of this? So one of the things that happened in 2019 is Zuckerberg was called to task and was asked to think about, what happened in the US 2016 election, what happened in Brexit. And he said, I don't think it's right for a private company to censor politicians in a democracy. And I think most of us can agree with that. I don't think that is an egregious statement at all. However, we're not taking into account the power of Facebook, particularly to circumvent the press, to undermine other public officials, to attack and defame one's opponents, and to confuse and incite the public. So as things developed and talk of regulation abounded about social media, as this notion of self-regulation just was not taking shape, Facebook in a policy document wrote in January 2020, in the absence of regulation, Facebook and other companies are left to design their own policies. We have based ours on the principle. Sorry, some of my Zoom stuff is getting in the way here. We have based ours on the principle, it's weird, that people should be able to hear from those who wish to lead them, quote unquote, warts and all. And what this doesn't show us is the machinery within Facebook that is so consequential for political campaigns that it allows this problem of disinformation to proliferate at scale in ways that it never could have on other mediums. disinformation at scale just simply cannot proliferate through print and other forms of journalism, because there are these other gatekeeping functions. And in many ways, Facebook is abdicating its role as a gatekeeper and suggesting that, well, it's up to the politicians what they say and do, and we're not going to apply any of our fact-checking labels. We're going to let it happen. And never mind the scale. The scale's fine. Don't worry about it. Don't look over at the scale. Whatever you do, don't look at the scale, right? And so when a politician can reach tens of millions of people with claims that an election has been rigged, that the only thing left to do is to stand up for your rights and go to a protest, it hits different, particularly when it comes from a sitting politician. If you are a political opponent and you're not perceived to have power, when you're a political opponent and you don't command the military, those ideas do not take hold in the public's mind as they do when they come from a sitting public figure. As well, we saw the development of many different theories about the coronavirus, many different ideas about governments that were seeking to use the coronavirus to oppress citizens, to the point where there was so many scams, grifts, and hoaxes on social media that it became almost impossible to moderate it at scale. At one point, there were over 160,000 new domains registered with some form of COVID, coronavirus, or COVID-19 in the domain in the early days of the pandemic, which essentially meant that there was an overload of information where people were using, by any means necessary, social media to claim they were selling health insurance or masks or gloves or hand sanitizer, all kinds of things that never came in the mail, as well as alternative quote unquote cures. Some of these that became very popular and very politicized, like hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin, were traced back to early posts on Facebook and Twitter, and particularly YouTube. When it came to hydroxychloroquine, the initial amplification of that drug actually came from a couple of Bitcoin investors who were tweeting at Elon Musk. And so then it became a very contested political football, in the sense that the idea that the cure was already here, that coronavirus had showed up, but that hydroxychloroquine was already here, was an important political way to satiate the public and to make it seem as if the government was equipped to deal with such a pandemic. So we study all of these issues using our media manipulation casebook. And I invite you to go to mediamanipulation.org at some point, take a look at the case studies. And what we've developed is a method for thinking about, well, where are we in a media manipulation campaign, and where might we go next? And what are the common patterns and techniques that we must understand? And so we start to think about this in a life cycle model. That is, where is the campaign being planned? Step one. Where is the campaign seeded across social platforms and the web? That is, how is it traveling? 3, who's responding to it? Industry, activists, politicians, and journalists. I'm telling you right now, all the time, all day long, there are people wrong on the internet. There's something special about media manipulation and disinformation campaigns, though, particularly around stage 3, where they get uptake, they get refuted, they get debunked, they get talked about, they get amplified, and that is crucial. Then we look at mitigation. So for several years, there was really nothing to put there. As platform companies said, this is people's free speech. We're not gonna go against this. But now what we have are a litany of different ways in which we might see media manipulation or disinformation mitigated, including things like de-indexing things from search, or deplatforming certain actors, or demonetizing certain kinds of content. And so there's a lot of different things that go on now, and we've tried to categorize and list them on the casebook so that you can take a look at what kind of strategies are available. And then we look at the adjustments by manipulators to the new environments. Every one of these stages is an opportunity for policy as well, which is, I want you to think about this in terms of A, B, C, D. Who is involved in each stage? Actors, behavior, content, and design. So at each stage, there's something going on related to all four of these elements, where maybe it's something where the manipulation campaign was planned on one platform, and then when it was seeded using bots or other kinds of impersonation technologies. Maybe the response was something that was manufactured, which is to say that it was seeded into journalists' replies. Instead of trying to get organic attention to an issue, you'll often see manipulators going into journalists' replies and saying, hey, did you see this? Did you see this video? If you want to see a litany of that, go on Twitter today and look at the hashtags for thanks Pfizer or thanks Moderna. You'll see these clips of people shaking uncontrollably, almost looking like they're having a seizure. And you'll often see them in the replies to journalists, because people are trying to call attention to this idea that there's this unrecognized side effect of the vaccines. And those kind of videos are running rampant currently. As well, mitigation. Well, how do you deal with something like that? If it's not coordinated so much as it is something that is coming together organic, it's a much more difficult problem. But if it is something coordinated, where it's the same 50 some odd accounts that are doing this, and that are doing it day in and day out, maybe there is a strategy, not just something that the platform companies can do, but press or civil society could raise awareness about. But ultimately, if any of this is profitable or is working politically, we're going to see it happen over and over and over again, unfortunately. And so these manipulators are careerists. There's a lot of repeat offenders. I'm sure in each of your political contexts, you know who they are, and you keep saying to yourself, I don't know why they keep getting away with it. And a lot of it has to do with because the way the technology works is so predictable. The infrastructure works the same way every time. And if you don't have policy that you can lean on, it's going to keep happening in the same way. So when we talk about, well, who pays for misinformation, we're talking about a whole bunch of different professional classes. Over the pandemic, I was involved in a couple of different congressional hearings, one particularly on misinformation, conspiracy theories, and infodemics, challenges and opportunities for stopping the spread online. And ultimately, the Congress in the US is pretty far behind in terms of thinking about the challenges posed by social media, not just as a technical problem, but also as one that has financial costs. And so when we're looking at particular case studies and the depths and the details, as researchers, we're trying to understand what are those social implications. So who actually is paying the price? We know journalists pay the price. For every story that a journalist has to write debunking some kind of nonsense online, that's a trade-off. That's one less story they write about climate change. That's one less story they write about local crime. That's one less story they write about sports. These are resources that are being spent because disinformation at scale is allowed to proliferate. Public health professionals also pay the price. Countless doctors have talked to me about how they get into an interaction with their patient and their patient thinks the vaccine is dangerous. And then when they ask, well, what kind of danger, they'll talk about things that they've heard on podcasts or YouTube or saw on Facebook. Particularly lately, the notion that people are just dying suddenly from the vaccine is preventing people from getting the bivalent booster. Civil society leaders, of course, have to come up and spend their budgets on communication strategies to deal with disinformation on particular topics. And then law enforcement as well have had to deal with disinformation related to particularly public protests and other kinds of skirmishes that have come up, particularly in the US around racial justice. But I want to go in depth on one case study, and then I'm going to wrap it up. Talking about public health professionals. So during the pandemic, there was a documentary that had come out. It was not too long, under half an hour, and it was called The Plandemic. And it was something that featured a disgraced scientist claiming that the vaccines were somehow poisonous. This was before a vaccine had even rolled out. And in the documentary, they were claiming that masks were making people sick. And this was something that was being orchestrated around a meme that already existed. Another thing that I do when I'm not doing this, I'm writing about memes. I have a book out about meme wars, where we talk about all of the different ways in which memes are used to spread information online. So this term plandemic, which is not a word, comes from this meme where there was this idea that liberal or progressive candidates were oppressing, particularly in the US context, Trump, and had planned the pandemic all along. So that key word was something that this documentary was able to harness and use to distribute its wares to an already invested audience, because the audience was already using the term. And so it was a pretty unique way to get right into the heart of a term that was already circulating online. We see that happening right now with the term the Great Reset. There's been a couple of books even by noted conspiracy theorists, one of them by Alex Jones recently, called The Great Reset. So anyhow, the plandemic comes out, and of course it's going to be banned on platforms because it contains so much medical misinformation. But they employ a tactic that's really something that we see pretty often by these groups. It's called distributed amplification. And this is when participants rapidly and widely share sensitive or banned content on their personal social media accounts in an effort to evade platform mitigation efforts or dominate the information ecosystem with repetitive content. We've seen this happen before. Sometimes it's referred to as the Streisand effect. So anytime you want to remove something from the internet, you say, don't look at the elephant, people start looking at the elephant, right? And so this picture on one side of the screen of this beautiful estate is Barbara Streisand's mansion. And it was used in a California ecological report to talk about erosion on the beach. And she wanted this removed from the internet, and people started putting it up over and over and over again. This tactic also became very popular during the time that Anonymous was trolling Tom Cruise over Scientology. And so every time Scientology would try to get this video of Tom Cruise removed from the internet, it would go back up by the hundreds online within days. And so the website for the plandemic had this particular call to action on it. It said, "Our videos are being taken down every minute. We appreciate your support. More coming soon. In an effort to bypass the gatekeepers of free speech, we invite you to download this interview by simply clicking the link below and uploading directly to all of your favorite platforms." So this was a way in which they were trying to get people to participate, use their own accounts, and then become invested in breaking the terms of service on each platform as a form of activism. And so what does this all mean? Well, if there was a law of disinformation, I think it's everything open will be exploited. So the ability for people to have open accounts online, for us to have these massively open social networks is now a vulnerability in our society. The once celebrated idea of free speech and this belief that algorithms work independent of any kind of individual's will just isn't the case. People do get coordinated and do figure out ways to circumvent or overcome any kind of platform company mitigation effort. And the more dogged the initiative and the more pushback that these individuals get, the more emboldened they become, the more savvy they become, the more we see their techniques develop and shift and change in reaction to what's going on. So how do we apply policy? Well, every time we think about this, we have to think about, well, where are we going to apply policy? Are we going to apply policy to actors? That is, are we going to have more litigation around defamation, libel? Are we going to apply some kind of policy to behaviors? Are we going to say there needs to be truth in advertising online and that everybody should know exactly who's paying for advertising and how are they getting it? Should they know if they're interacting with an automated account or a real person? There are lots of different ways in which we might think about making policy for behaviors. Content's a real hard one because in the United States, and if I say the word free speech too loud, I'm sure some lawyer will come running. But we don't have laws against hate speech, and the kind of harassing content that I've been witness to online is not taken very seriously by any kind of law enforcement. But I think the most promising angle for policy is design. And I put this image here to remind us that in some ways, we've been here with the design. If you think about the record player as the platform, the record is the content, the technology, the design of social media is really amplification. That's what we're dealing with, is that it amplifies things. And then we don't exactly know how it's going to be used by actors. See, the way that this human has decided to take these technologies that don't, these technologies are not designed in concert with one another. The person who's making a telephone is not thinking about the person who's making a record player, right? And so we have to, when we think about policy, we have to think about that policy context and that environment and the ways in which different actors are going to use the same technologies that might be banal in one case to do damage in another. And I just really like this picture because it reminds us of the unpredictability of human actors as they think about, well, how am I going to get my message heard? As well, what about public interest obligations? What if we were to cast aside the fact that there are all of these problems? What could we do if we tried to increase access to talk? So there's a lot of, dust up about local news, but I think one of the things that we might need to shift our focus on is to think about, well, what would happen if we gave public interest obligations to social media companies so that they were increasing people's access to timely, accurate local knowledge? And I will use the word knowledge here instead of information, because knowledge is something that is vetted. There's a method to it. It's more expensive usually to produce. But in the United States, you can't have a radio station that isn't willing to broadcast the weather and school closures. We do have to have some kind of public interest content circulating on other forms of media. So why not social media? And I think that that might be an innovative bipartisan or tripartisan set of policies that could be utilized as an opening to get at some of this disinformation. And I think it would displace a lot of disinformation if you had more talk online that was vetted and publicly available. And then I just want to remind us and close by talking about what are the costs of doing nothing. One of the things that misinformation reminds me of is the early days of tobacco, where people were saying, well, you know, smoking is a luxury. It's not that big of a deal. Everybody does it. It's low cost. It doesn't hurt anybody. And then over time, it took people outside of that industry to make the research and to be independent. And right now we're facing a bit of a crisis where Facebook in particular has spread out its web of influence to the point where it's very difficult to find researchers that are not also taking money or data from these companies. I am staunchly opposed to that related to my own research and my team, but I'm consistently brought into meetings and spaces and places where I'm encouraged to partner with these corporations. But I do not think that that's going to lead to the best and most independent research. So I'll close with this, which is like secondhand smoke, misinformation damages the quality of public life. Every conspiracy theory, every propaganda or disinformation campaign affects people, and the expense of not responding can grow exponentially over time. Since the 2016 US election, newsrooms, technology companies, civil society organizations, politicians, educators, and researchers have been working to quarantine the viral spread of misinformation. The true costs have been passed on to them and to the everyday folks who rely on social media to get news and information. So thank you all so much. I'm going to stop sharing here.
Thank you very much, Joan. Very interesting and scary. And yeah, I'd like to hand over to Nadia, maybe at the stage, to start sharing some of the questions that we collected on Slido.
Yes, well, also from my side. Thanks a lot. Very, very interesting insights. And we've gathered a lot of very interesting questions on Slido. And I would say maybe the biggest block of them, you already started talking about the different policies, how can policymakers address disinformation, what are legislative solutions to also fight discrimination on social media. So there were a few questions that addressed this. So yeah, if you want to maybe dive deeper a bit on the policy side.
Yeah, I think there's a lot that can be done. First and foremost, innovation is in a rut right now. I think there can be antitrust measures that look at competition, look at the way in which some of these companies are getting buying up smaller companies that it could become competition and really decimating them. The control over data is incredibly important. Shohana Zuboff's book on surveillance capitalism really outlines this in a way that, well, if you finish it, it feels undeniable. I think the book is 600 pages, so you can get the notes on that. But the point is that we didn't really sign up for this. When we signed up for social media, I'm sure nobody signs on to Instagram and thinks, hey, this picture of my spaghetti dinner is going to end up in a database at Harvard later today because they're collecting, you know, massive amounts of that use, you know, such and such a hashtag. And so there are all these ways that our data is circulating online that require consumer protections. And so I think that there is a lot that can be done on the consumer protection side. Now, another way to understand this aspect of consumer protection is to also think about children. Of course, social media companies will say, you know, we don't allow children to use our apps. Children are forbidden from this. But that's not what's happening, really. We have to be policy realists in the sense that we know that children are using these apps. So having a standard in which if you are making an app, there's a minimum viable product where you describe the kind of data you need to collect so that you can do the technology, so that you can provide the service, and that you can't collect more data than that. And so having a minimum viable product standard that would limit the kind of data that's collected would protect children, as well as set a precedent that this unbridled data economy that is driving so much of this intensive engagement online is just something that's not going to be tolerated. Another kind of regulation that I don't think would be very successful in a government context, but could be something that is a good faith effort from these companies would be to look at particular posts and understand the mechanisms by which it's becoming viral, especially on certain hot topics or certain wedge issues. We know that there is dehumanizing and vitriolic content all over these platforms. But when it comes to hate, harassment, and incitement, these platforms should have a duty of care to their customers, and that should be something that is monitored and audited, similar to the way the EPA works in the United States, the Environmental Protection Agency. We do need to have these standards, and this goes to the scale question, which is to say that I would never be able to fly more airplanes than I could land, right? And so if you're building and using and serving a product where you can't guarantee the safety of those who are using it, then perhaps you are out of scale with your own business's capabilities. And so we have to begin to think about scale and potentially descaling these companies in such a way so that we can develop the kind of protocols and guardrails and air traffic control that we would need in order to operate these platforms safely. Lastly, I would say sanctions and punitive measures need to be developed, particularly for sitting politicians who are using these platforms to incite violence.
Okay, well, thanks a lot. Well, I hear it's well, it's a very interdisciplinary topic, so it really goes across a lot of different policy areas and different levels also. Another question which was very popular, which also goes in the direction of how can also these type of tools and regulations for media manipulation be used in a positive manner? So to promote policy implementation, behavioral changes that are needed, and if you also have any examples for that.
I think the question is asked, can this be used for good or in some way? Can what we know be used for good? The reason why this stuff travels is because it's and it moves so quickly is because it hits two key factors. There was a great study done at MIT about this, I think in 2018. And two of the main factors here about why lies travel faster than anything else on Twitter in particular is because it's novel and outrageous. So if you are first in, so usually this happens during breaking news context, something atrocious happens. If you are first in with something that is both novel and outrageous, you are likely to get the highest proportion of clicks, likes, and shares. You're likely to gain that engagement. Now, for a while, that used to be more clickbaity kind of stuff, which, you'd click on it, say, there'd be a mass shooting and say 5 things you need to know about the shooter and blah, blah, blah. And then it would be just, pretty banal stuff. But these techniques, these tactics have become so widespread that you see them applied to political opponents. So the minute there is some kind of attack or anomalous event, breaking news event, you will instantly see people start to attack each other's political opponents. And those groups of people that are being attacked, or in some instances, someone is being accused of a crime that they didn't do, they're being identified and having their biography laid out, or they're being doxxed. There's really nothing they can do to correct the record. And we see this happen over and over and over again. So unfortunately, there's no way to really use what we know about what makes things go viral to spread the truth. What you need to do is have a system in place that moderates content in a way that I want you to flip this in your mind from moderation to curation, right? The idea would be, and Twitter was they were trending in this direction around their trends where they had started to hire librarians to curate the kinds of things that their algorithms brought your attention to, and they added extra context to that, and things had cleaned up. Now is different. It's very different. And their mission of producing a healthy public discourse seems to be out the window. But unfortunately, like, we can't think about the rubric in the same way. The truth is boring. There's nothing that scandalous about it. It's never as juicy as it seems. And so unfortunately, when we have this high preponderance of user-generated content, and then you have groups of coordinated actors trying to confuse the public, and using some of the public's own internal biases and their homophobia, their transphobia, their racism to play into these issues, unfortunately, is just a very toxic combination. And in some ways, it's a product of the design. That is to say, there's not appropriate curation.
Okay, yeah, I think what you said in the end now sums it up very well. Kind of it's about the design of the social media system.
Maybe we can have one last short,
yeah.
We'll wrap it up.
Yeah, definitely. So because seeing the time already. Well, you'd also talked about the costs of the disinformation, and there are specific groups who are impacted by it. And so there was also a question if there's any evidence on the socioeconomic characteristics of these groups. Are there some that are more vulnerable to be misinformed or be targeted by disinformation campaigns, or all groups equally?
This is a really good question, and we need to do more research on this. So what's interesting about the notion of targeting is, I think that if we look at even prior to social media, there are certain groups of people that have more disinformation or more misinformation about them as a group. And you can think about that. We used to talk about them as stereotypes. We'd say that there are these misleading stereotypes about Black people, about Asian people, about women. And so those kind of stereotypes, though, are things that we've always had to deal with. But if you think about something like scientific racism, so you had, a whole history of not just phrenology, but even genetics that were trying to prove that certain races were more violent or certain races were more intelligent than others, which didn't pan out. It didn't go the way that we know in our modern context. But nevertheless, when that was considered knowledge, it was used to oppress other people. The difference here is the specificity, I think, which is to say that it goes very quickly, and the specificity is very particular. And so as a result, when we're dealing with something like medical misinformation, and it's not the same as trying to say, oh, we need to have a public health campaign so that people know the vaccines are free and they know where to go get them. It's so specific that people have these particular kinds of beliefs that you really have to start to measure which population is believing which rumor or which hoax, and how do we then come at that in a very targeted and specific way. Now, in the US, that might look like creating curricula or public health campaigns specifically for older white conservatives who believe that the vaccine is causing sudden death. It also might mean creating public health campaigns for younger Black people who are like, don't understand, you know, how to get access to the vaccines, and that there's no natural immunity because you're Black. For a while in the United States, there was this belief that African Americans were somehow immune to coronavirus, right? And so the specificity is something that we need to shift, and we need to make more sense of, I think, in policy. And I just want to say thank you again to everyone. It's been great to be here.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks for your intervention and for speaking to us here. And thanks for everybody attending the second event of the speaker series today. And of course, thanks to Nadia and to Frank and his team, and also to the ZOE team. And yeah, we hope to see you at our next event. It's about basic needs within planetary boundaries. And is it affordable? And Anna Kuti from the New Economics Foundation will come on the 22nd of February. We will let you know as soon as the registration link is open. Goodbye, and we all wish you a nice day.